welcome everybody to our Arcview Access event today, Psychedelics as Medicine and Venture Opportunities. I'm Jeff Finkel, CEO of the Arcview Group, and I'm really excited today about this program, and particularly excited to bring you programming that extends our traditional cannabis-focused subject matter into related industries like psychedelics, and as you will see in the near future, industrial hemp. So today, as part of our Arcview Accessing programming series, we're going to help audience members understand the fundamentals of psychedelics, how they can assist with a variety of behavioral health disorders, such as anxiety and non-treatable depression, the legalities of the industry, and what makes it a compelling investment opportunity. But before we begin our programming, let me introduce you, or reintroduce you as the case may be, to the Arcview Group, which has evolved quite a bit over the last 2 years, as has our industry in general, and have many of you. The Arcview Group is a financial services firm that operates 3 subsidiaries: Arcview Capital, our FINRA licensed broker-dealer, which provides investment banking services and is soon launching a crowdfunding site; Arcview Ventures, our principal investing group, and operator of the Arcview Collective Fund, a member-managed venture capital fund with 78 active limited partner members; and Arcview Management Consulting, our consulting group offering cannabis license pursuit and growth management and a variety of other practice areas. All of this is supported by our thought leadership initiatives, such as our membership programs, our event, such as our digital programmings and events like today, our topically themed Arcview Access series, which takes a deep dive into topics germane to our industry, or I guess I should say our industries. And in addition to that, our Town Hall series, which takes a regional view, a state-by-state view of the business dynamics in a particular state. And rounding out those digital events is our CEO Circles and Tales from the Top, on which we get to hear the challenges and success stories endured by many of the great C-suite executives and successful entrepreneurs in these industries. And we will co-produce a number of live events and themed salon events and VIP dinners, so stay tuned for details on those events that are upcoming. But before I proceed, let me just give you a quick overview of some of the events that are upcoming. Thursday, November 4th at 1 p.m., we're going to have an Arcview Access on infrastructure. It's one of a 3-part series. The first one is called Infrastructure, Pain, and Possibilities, Building Diversity Inclusion into Your Foundation. And it's, again, first of our 3-part series. The second event that we're doing will be Monday, November 8th at 2 p.m. Pacific time. It's for our Women's Inclusion Network. It's a mentorship workshop featuring Dashita and the Knox Docs for women's inclusion members. So more info on that on our website. Erica, maybe you could put that in the chat, Arcview Group //win. And then on Wednesday, November 10th at 1 p.m. Pacific time, Arcview Access Infrastructure, Pains, and Possibilities Part 2, we're going to explore the back office, HR, accounting, insurance, and legal, and what's available and why it's difficult in our industry. All right, let me take a moment before we move on to thank our terrific alliance partners for supporting these events and who are, irrespective of supporting our events, incredible resources to navigate these industries. Eric, I think you have a slide, if you could put that up possibly. Well, while it's coming up, we have Zuber Law, who is participating in this panel today, Green Growth CPA, Alpha Root for your insurance needs, GrowFlow, Work, Dwayne Morris, and Ice Miller. And if anybody is interested in learning more about our Alliance Partner program, please contact Jake Kusarik, our VP of Business Development. Erica, maybe you can put Jake's email in the chat box as well. Finally, we will be surveying you during the session, so please answer as we aim to really bring you content that is most valuable to you, and answering these surveys will help ensure that we do exactly that. All right, so with that, let's move on to the programming. It's my pleasure to introduce Colin O'Reilly of Arcview Capital. Colin will introduce the panel and he will moderate today's session. So thank you all, and take it away, Colin.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. I'm excited to introduce the 5 panelists we have today as well. And thanks to everybody for joining, especially to the panelists. We have a good group here, a host of folks smarter than me. And I'm excited to, this is our second psychedelic event here. And I'm very excited to explore this further with the expertise we have here together today. So a lot to cover in an hour. We have Dr. Gigi Q and Olivia Mannix from Aphrodite Health, Tom Zuber, managing partner from Zuber Lawler, Wiley Gray from Veterans of War, and Henri St. Cassieff, co-founding partner of the Conscious Fund. And without further ado, I will introduce Olivia and Wiley for the initial conversation here. Sorry, Dr. Gigi Ku and Wiley for the initial conversation here. And Wiley, I think we could start with you about the work you're doing with the Veterans of War.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. As you said, my name is Wiley Gray, and I'm the executive director of Veterans of War, which is a nationwide nonprofit that seeks to connect teams of veterans to guided psychedelic therapy. I got into this business because there's a very real need in the veteran sector. Right now, we as a veteran community lose more veterans in a year to a preventable outcome in suicide than we have in 20 years of active combat operations. For over 15 years now, the suicide epidemic has rocked my community. I served in the Marines from 2000 until 2008, active duty. I came home and I went to a really good school, and I feel very fortunate to be able to have any platform whatsoever with which to be able to talk about, what veterans are really kind of going through in today's day, especially as it relates to mental health care and the VA. When I came back, things were really in shambles, and the traditional mental health care field was one which the paradigm seemed to support. Here's a handful of pills. Let us know how that helps you. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the course of the last 15 years, as I mentioned, is not a cessation in the suicide epidemic. In fact, it's stayed steady. It's grown some years, in fact. What we really need is solutions. The statistic is jarring, but it actually kind of minimizes the real numbers. When we say 17 veterans a day died of suicide, what that really accounts to is more than 6,000 a year, and that's a crazy, crazy number. And it's completely preventable. And I think that's where psychedelics sort of enter the equation. When I found them really only 5 years ago, it was after struggling many, many years with depression, with insomnia, with a high anxiety, and honestly, just a really horrible quality of life. And what I work for and what I really believe in is creating a path for veterans to sort of really come home. I think that's not a lot to ask. And when it comes to safe and effective solutions for recovery from the unseen scars of war and psychological trauma, I don't know that there's anything on the planet that works with the complete and total support of science better than psychedelics. It's safe. And for me and for the groups that I lead to healing ceremonies all around the world, it's shown to be an incredible connector. It helps people find their sense of self again, their sense of community, their sense of interconnectivity. So when we talk about psychedelics, as an investment opportunity, obviously it absolutely is. But what we really need to talk about is the human toll on the line, which is, the huge base of humanity right now that's suffering from trauma. And we're going to desperately need effective medicines to combat that. And I think that's for me what the psychedelic journey is, sort of how it got me into this space.
Thanks, Wiley. I think Dr. Ku on the patient treatment side could help expand upon what this treatment looks like. I'm sure everyone's really curious as to, what an inpatient and outpatient scenario looks like and what the integration afterwards looks like. It's new to a lot of folks. So,
First of all, thanks for having me here on Arcview. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me just start with by way of my background. I'm a Mount Sinai trained physician. My specialty is chronic pain management. I have a subspecialty in traumatic brain injury, and I've been doing that for more than 20 plus years. I've been in biotech for more than 10 plus years. I've co-founded several companies, including a wound therapy company that has an FDA-approved product. I've also been a co-founder of a psychedelic company called Trip Therapeutics that I co-founded with my husband, Jim Koo. Trip focuses on using psychedelics for eating disorders and fibromyalgia, which is basically pain all over your body. So I really got interested in the psychedelic space because of my background in chronic pain. There's a lot of need to improve the treatments for chronic pain, because honestly, the treatments that we have are really not very helpful. We have anti-inflammatories on one end, and we have opioids on the other end, and we know all the terrible things that opioids have done to many families in this country. And so when I started reading about what psychedelics could do for the mental health space, I started to feel that they really could be applied to chronic pain and traumatic brain injury. And because chronic pain is really a brain disorder, it's a problem with how pain is perceived and how pain is processed. And I felt that psychedelics could have a huge potential in that area. And that's how I really got interested in the space. And I really, as time goes on, you'll see a lot of companies and different organizations really looking at psychedelics, not just for your classic mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, but really for multiple other neurological conditions, such as dementia, stroke, even sexual dysfunction. So it's a really exciting place to be, and I'm very fortunate to be here.
Yeah, it sounds like there's potentially a gap to be bridged here between Wiley's work in the retreat setting domestically and internationally, and you more focused on a clinical setting with a different, not to say not offensively, but a more refined approach, possibly with clinical trials and those kinds of things that Wiley's do as well. But it's Eastern versus Western almost. And how's that? What's the hurdle for people to not look at it so much in the traditional setting and more of the a medicalized setting and see the value of both?
Sure, that's a great question. I don't think what I'm involved in or what Wiley is are really polar opposites. I think what we're all trying to do is provide better access for patients. What I'm involved with is proving to the medical community that psychedelics are really a potential treatment going through the clinical trial process, in the FDA. Really what's pretty exciting about it is that the potential benefits that have already been shown, particularly with MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're in a phase 3 clinical trial, which is usually the final process before a drug is approved. And the second one is with psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms for treatment-resistant depression. These patients, particularly in the treatment-resistant depression, have tried all kinds of medications and really failed in multiple therapies. And so the clinical efficacy that's been shown in these trials is quite exciting. And so once, assuming the drugs are approved through the clinical trials process, this will give a greater access to many patients. Because what happens is insurance companies really tend to follow once the drug is approved. So, like I said, I don't think what I'm involved in or what Wiley doing is like polar opposites. I think it's just providing a different form of access. And, I get it. Like if I had a family member with PTSD, I would definitely go to Wiley's retreat because it is a really, severe disorder. And everyone's looking for access. And I think having the drugs approved really proves to the medical community there's so much tremendous benefit. And if psychedelics are approved through the FDA process, they'll become probably one of the mainstay treatments for therapy for multiple conditions, especially for depression, PTSD, and they really could be the disruptor for the antidepressants.
I'd like to
Wiley,
piggyback if I could.
Go ahead, Wiley.
Thanks so much. There's two real points I think that really bear talking about. I think, I sort of touched on it a bit in my intro. The old model was not interactive. This new model of healthcare is interactive. And when we talk about, doing it in a clinical setting versus doing it in a workshop setting, I never call it a retreat. When you're working with trauma, you're going directly into trauma. You're not retreating from anything, and it's very hard work. So when you're working with plant medicines and you go to a workshop, that is, firstly, it's incredibly necessary that we do this, because the reality is, and the legal reality is, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, is we every day, like I said, the veteran community is losing 17 veterans to suicide. How long do I wait for the trials to finish? How long do I wait for my brothers and sisters to die on an active ticking clock? The only ethical response I had was create that programming so that they have an access point. I have to do now the back end work of collecting data to support why this is efficacy, why the efficacy of this is incredibly important to talk about, and why it's such a critical role in the future of mental health care recovery. But what it really presents to us is a paradigm shift from one of being inactive to one to being interactive with the medicine that you're taking. And I think that's a critical part. And I think that access is critically important. And it's a shame that we can't provide that. Like, I had to take a guerrilla healthcare mission to Peru to have access the first time. And how many people have died? How many veterans have died just since I've started my work because they didn't have access to not only this information, but this critical life-saving programming?
So yeah, Tom Zuber will talk later in the event about the legal hurdles. But what have you seen as the other access to information? Sounds like one clearly in your mind, but what have been more of the soft, more mental hurdles for people to accept this as
we've had a very
as legitimate
effective
medicine?
60-plus year propaganda campaign led by our own government that's told us that these things are bad, that they're evil. And I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Missouri. That's where it's ingrained. And this idea now that these things that were literally demonized as counterculture and that they would fry your brain, the reality is the science seems to support they regrow parts of your brain, and they're anti-inflammatory. They, in fact, are so critically important to your recovery in some situations that it's downright criminal that they weren't ever told to us the correct way. We should have been educated. And I feel honestly a bit of umbrage that we were not given that correct information. And again, I lived my whole life and I watched my friends kill themselves, and they never knew this tool existed. And that's a form of tyranny that I have trouble defining.
Yeah, Wiley makes some very important points, because unfortunately these medicines are labeled as a Scheduled I drug. This means that they're illegal, that the government has deemed them as providing no medical benefit and high abuse potential. And when in actuality, psychedelics are actually used to treat addiction. And psychedelics has been around for a long time, but in the 50s, there's actually a lot of research going on in psychedelics. There's more than 1,000 articles on psychedelics, and it's very unfortunate that, as Wiley mentioned, that the government really put the squash on it with the counterculture, the war on drugs, because they have such huge potential,
There's a tragedy in my generation, and the real tragedy is that's gone on for more than my generation. It's been ongoing.
It's safe to say you feel like it's picking up steam, it's snowballing in recent years, and cannabis paved the path for that a little bit. And then also I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, Wiley, specifically on what has this year done to the pandemic specifically, since January 2020 and ongoing, has typically working with veterans and the resulting trauma there has, I don't want to call it investment opportunity, but opportunities to help people, especially in this environment, as mental health has become even more of a crisis.
I feel like the programming at Veterans of War is a very critical component to proving out this model of mental health care recovery. What we do is we provide group therapy with a psychedelic component. And we are very meticulous. It's a very high-touch program. It's a 6-month program, in fact, where participants work in a group, and they have bi-weekly group therapy for 2 months prior to access to medicine. And then they go to the actual workshop medicine phase, where they have 4 opportunities to have ayahuasca ceremonially. Definitely not in a clinical setting whatsoever. I wonder at some points, and this is a different topic, but I wonder at some points, how important it is to take it out of its setting and whether that should happen at all. There's a very real aspect of set and setting that's a part of any psychedelic journey, but especially these ancient entheogens such as ayahuasca, ibogaine, San Pedro, peyote, any of these, for example. But after the medicine phase, then the real bulk of my work starts, which is the integration and support. That's something that we don't talk about enough. Access is critical. I would even argue that access is probably 50%. And that's what the pandemic has showed me. Like I had to sit by, and my program is supposed to be 6 months, but this last program lasted more than 18 months because of the pandemic. We couldn't travel to another country to have life-saving medicine. And so that immediately made very clear to me the pressure point of we need to have this in America. And Veterans of War has been vocal advocates nationwide for changing the laws and the scheduling of these very critical life-saving medicines. We were critical. The veteran narrative, I think, is critical to changing some of these ideas for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's very hard to be very critical of somebody just trying to recover, somebody that is largely seen as in service to your nation. We didn't ask to be put in these situations, and we served at the beck and call of the people that asked us to do it. So denying service, that right to try is very strong in our community. And the second reason is I think we might be the only bipartisan issue left in the government in America. It's a crazy landscape. But what we provide, like I said, is that foundational critical programming structure that hopefully professionals will improve on, so that when it scales out to the masses, when everyone does have access to this life-saving medicine, it's grounded in an ethical, community-based framework. Because I think that's probably the most important component to recovery is the integration and support on the back end. I think anybody worth their salt in the psychedelic field will say that the real work starts when the medicine stops.
Yeah, if I could just add there, and I think Wiley makes a very important point that psychedelics are meant to start the journey. You're meant to continue on with your therapy. And so it's not meant to be as like a one-time thing and then things are going to get better right away. It's really meant to allow the healing to start so you can continue on with your treatment. And that's really what's important about it. And I think people need to remember that. Whatever, if you're using psychedelics for mental health or for pain, there's a lot of healing that needs to still go on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. As we pivot into here in a few minutes here into more of the investment focused piece of the event, you hear a lot of people, and you guys have mentioned it too, is the data collection, data points, metrics there. It's always concern from investors on, where's their IP around this, and not just so much from the formularies and that kind of thing, but data collection. Companies essentially become tech companies as they've evolved too, or at least a hybrid. And I'm curious what data you are collecting. Wiley, it sounds like on the, more of the, the psychotherapy side, it's more of a integration and an ongoing process versus maybe the hard data Dr. Koo is collecting on the pain management side. But I'm curious from both of you, and you guys, either of you can pick up the question on, what are the data points you're collecting? What do you think is most important, and what's it proving so far, and where's there gaps?
Okay, so I'm not in the business of creating IP. I'm in the business of saving lives. So the data collection points that I collect are revolved mainly around how we define PTSD, its symptomology, and its expression. My job in large terms is to work with ayahuasca specifically in order to shift the default mode network, which is how people respond to their everyday life. It really governs your basic response to almost everything. My theory is that the expressions of many of these traumas are really just in the end try ways for your elegant solutions for your body to cope with these enormous traumas. So if we can treat the root of the trauma, then they won't need to express themselves quite the same way. That's the data points that I try to collect is how has this changed? How has your viewpoint on life changed? Where were you when we started? Where are you now? So for our first program cohort, Fire Team Alpha, one of the veterans, when we started, I literally called him when he was getting ready to kill himself. So to say that he was at the bottom of the CAPS 5 indicators for expression of trauma, I would say would probably be a very large understatement. And after just this last, we have one more group therapy integration session left, but this last one that we had, I asked him how he was feeling on a scale of 1 to 10. Where was he now? And he said, smiling, I'd say I'm an 8. I've still got some work to do, but now I can see the path. It's going to be tough to collect this data. And I do absolutely appreciate the clinical role. However, I think that what we tend to do in the West a lot is fail to realize the importance of some of the medicinal roles of these compounds. And these are medicines. I use that word specifically. It's important to have the right framework when you talk about these things, because if not, they can be used poorly. And I totally understand that some people are going to, use these substances recreationally. That's not the people I'm talking to. I'm talking to a community that's desperate for solutions, that are dying at a record rate, that need a real path towards recovery. So when it comes to data points, I collect the data points that support the narrative that shows that this path is effective.
So I'll just follow up with a couple of things that Wiley mentioned, and I know that our time is limited. So Wiley talked about how psychedelics work through the default mode network. So basically, I was just gonna, so the audience understands what the default mode network is and how psychedelics work. And just really quickly, the default mode network is really what is functional connections in different parts of our brain. That's really responsible of what we think of ourselves, and it's really self-introspection. It's basically how we view ourselves, both in a positive and negative way, that's based on various experiences of our life. And it's really most active when we're daydreaming. So it's believed that many conditions such as depression and anxiety are due to negative repetitive thoughts of oneself. So it's believed that psychedelics work by resetting the brain to allow new neural connections to form that were previously not there, which allow the healing to begin. So you'll hear this term neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, again, is the ability to form new connections, and it's most commonly seen in very young children. Their brains are not only growing, but they're forming new connections. So the thought is that the psychedelics quiet down the default network, allow the brain to reset so these new neural connections can form, and then allow the healing to begin.
Thanks to you both very much. We hope to have you back as well. And I'm going to pivot over to the next portion of the event here, which is to talk about the investment side, which I alluded to with Wiley. And but it was great to get the foundation from both of you on what we're looking at here. And
thank you very much.
Thank you. And now on to the second portion. I'd like to introduce Tom Zuber from Zuber Lawler, Olivia Mannix, she's a colleague of Dr. Coos at Aphrodite Health, and Henri St. Cassia of the Conscious Fund. And next we're going to talk about the regulatory landscape, what investment opportunities look like, how they're similar to cannabis, and how they differ, because it is, its own animal in a lot of regards. But cannabis did pave the way. That's why Arcview is involved here. Tom, I guess we'll start with you. What are we looking at from a legal perspective? What are the hurdles? How far have we come? Where are we now, and where are we headed?
Well, I think it's a good note, Colin, to say that cannabis in some ways is a preview of what we might expect to unfold in the psychedelics industry, including as to regulation, including as to investments, including as to the growth of a legal industry. There are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. I think that in some ways, the similarities reflect a bifurcation between legalization, increasing levels of legalization, it looks like, that'll occur at the municipal and even at the state level, starting with obviously Oregon, and obviously on the other hand, prohibition by the federal government. So that's going to play out in psychedelics as it did in cannabis, and other aspects are similar as well. For instance, you have in the context of that bifurcation, you have folks that are willing to take a closer look at assuming risk in the context of federal prohibition and launching companies and gaining the potentially large benefits of that. And we saw that happen in cannabis. It happened for my law firm 15 years ago. Nobody was touching cannabis work, and we were. And obviously we reap the benefits of that. It looks like that's happening in psychedelics as well. That'll happen for companies. It'll happen for financiers and investors, and that's a very exciting thing. There are going to also be some material differences. The cannabis market moved with a certain deliberate pace toward recreational legalization. And I don't think that that's going to happen in the same way in psychedelics. I think very few people do. This is going to be clinical, right? It's going to be much more medicinal. You're not going to be able to walk into a psychedelics dispensary and purchase something analogous to a joint to relax with your wife or husband or whoever at home. What's going to happen is you're going to go for serious treatment under the guidance of medical practitioners. And so that's going to be a material difference. And there are other material differences, and we could spend the whole set of hours just discussing those differences. But I think those are the highlights.
Great. And Olivia, you're someone, as an entrepreneur that has had success in both the cannabis and now the success story with Aphrodite as well. Has there been a different set of challenges, and what motivated you to pivot over?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me today, by the way. So I'm Olivia Mannix. I am the CSO and co-founder of Aphrodite. I also started Cannabrand back in 2013. We were the first cannabis marketing and consulting firm. So I've seen quite a few things in terms of businesses come to market and their trajectories. Some of the things that I've seen, and I do agree with Tom in terms of having more of a recreational legality of the psychedelic space is going to be really difficult. I think some of the takeaways from the cannabis industry are really looking at this more of as a medicine. I think that's truly important. And then also looking at some other key takeaways in terms of how psychedelics can be applied. So it's not necessarily just for mental health. Also, pain is huge. It's something that we're looking into. I'm really passionate about how your neurons can be transformed through psychedelics, as well as the different key indicators we can use there. And then looking at the industry as a whole, we're still in a very nascent space. So it's a really great time to get in early with some companies that have, a really great growth trajectory. And I'm really excited to be part of the industry.
Great. Thank you, Olivia. And Henri, you're one of those folks that looks at those opportunities that Olivia mentioned. What have you invested in so far? Where are you looking? How has it changed? Are we still in the seems like we're still in the early stage here, but there's also some companies that have become pretty well capitalized in a short period of time. So introduce yourself and tell us how the investment landscape looks to you.
Thank you, Colin. I'm Henri Sancassier. I run the Conscious Fund with my partner Richard. We are probably the most active early stage investor in psychedelic medicine. We've made 23 odd investments. We've incubated 13 companies. So we're pretty well versed in this market. I guess just to cut right back to basics, as all the panelists have touched on, you've got this, 3 groups of conditions. You've got mental health, you've got chronic pain, and you've got addiction. They've all got these big underserved patient populations, a lot of whom are pretty fed up of the conventional therapies that they're getting. And psychedelics, in a nutshell, are a group of compounds which can prove to be staggeringly effective. Our average figure is probably twice as effective, so a jump from 30 to 60% efficacy against conventional therapies. So this whole industrial renaissance has grown up in the last 3 years, and the aim of that is to take psychedelic compounds and put them in the hands of patients through a whole variety of models. The most common one is drug discovery. You take a compound and you put a drug through clinical trials. Very expensive, very high risk, very high reward. There's lots of activity around bricks and mortar clinics, wellness programs, addiction programs. So there's a kind of last mile industry where you're taking the compound and you're delivering it with a lot of therapy, a lot of support. And then you've got ancillary businesses, from everything from training to media to technology. But principally, we're talking about drug discovery and patient-facing therapies. It's a super high growth space. You've got companies jumping from $5-8 million up to $1 billion price targets. Lots of public activity. So it's a very good sector for early stage investors. It's not for amateurs. It's not something you want to dip into. It is very complex. We've got scientists, lawyers, advocates. We've got entrepreneurs. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem of complexity, but it's super exciting. And ultimately, as everybody on this webinar has indicated, it is a genuine revolution in healthcare, whether you're delivering it through pro bono programs like Wiley's, whether you're doing it commercially, whether you are growing your own mushrooms and self-medicating. However this happens, the results are very dramatic. There are a lot of people that need it. And ultimately, everybody, no matter what their role in the industry, is trying to deliver these therapies to as wide as possible a patient population.
And now, Tom, I'm assuming cannabis kind of had a template, the path to IPO or the state-based licenses. This looks a lot different. What are the and as Henri mentioned, there's people coming at it from multiple different avenues, from the treatment side to the drug discovery side. From a legal perspective, what are the critical milestones we need to hit to push forward?
There are a lot of question marks that are underneath that question. So one of them, for instance, is the role of the pharmaceutical industry in determining the course of things. And I personally, I guess I have an emotional or intellectual or philosophical dog in that fight. We represent pharmaceutical companies, and we're honored to do so. But I can tell you that it's been a blessing in cannabis that prohibition exists, right? Because it was this opportunity for such a wide variety of artistry and innovation and entrepreneurship to rise up. And now we have such an exciting selection, such an exciting variety of cannabis companies and cannabis products. And we wouldn't have this variety if prohibition didn't exist, because probably, I mean, if you think about it, it would have, cannabis would have lined up in the hands of a few companies, and they would have been pharmaceutical companies. And I'm not sure that that's the best result. So for me personally in psychedelics, I would very much like to see a similar thing happen here, right? Where we can have, psychedelic medicine has been around for millennia. And so here we are now finally focusing on it. But certain segments of our global community have been experiencing the benefits from this and touting the benefits of this for millennia. And so I'm quite worried about seeing one or two companies come in and sort of snatch the whole industry and to wrap it up in regulation or in patents or those sorts of things. So for me personally, I would like to see things unfold as they did in cannabis, at least to the extent that these entrepreneurs, these artists, these smaller companies had the chance to find their footing and to become larger companies and to find their own voice and their own place in the market. And then at some point, the larger companies will come in, but then you're going to have this bona fide variety where you have a much more diverse, a much more representative sampling of the global community that's actually bringing these products to a wider audience. So for me, that's one of the big question marks is how does pharma play into these things? Another big question mark is the FDA and what's the role of the FDA? Of course, there are some psychoactive products now that have achieved breakthrough status with the FDA. And that's, of course, for folks who don't know, MDMA and psilocybin were placed on the breakthrough fast track at the FDA, which means they'll have an easier time with trials and that sort of thing on a path toward some sort of regulated status. So that's an exciting development. But of course, psilocybin and other psychedelics still reside on Schedule 1 along with heroin. So as long as that's the case, and for folks who don't understand what a hypocrisy that is, it's really quite terrible because in order to reside on Schedule 1, you're essentially saying that there's no known accepted medical benefit to the substance that's on Schedule 1, and that's a farce, and we all know it. So that's quite hypocritical. So how is the federal government going to address that hypocrisy? And that's something that we're going to have to wait and find out. So there are so many question marks that could shift so dramatically the development of this industry in one direction or another. But I do think that what we're going to see for the next couple of years is we're going to see an increasing number of municipalities and states that are going to at least decriminalize and perhaps even legalize commercially on a commercial level, psilocybin and other psychoactive substances, as the state of Oregon did. California is pretty far along on that course right now. So California, for folks who don't know, it looks like we've just passed the point where we can start collecting signatures on a referendum to legalize psychedelics at the referendum level. And also Scott Weiner, a state senator here in California, is pushing legislation and seems to be, one, quite deliberate and focused and persistent about it, but two, actually seems to be making strides at achieving a buy-in, a sufficient threshold consensus of sorts amongst his colleagues in the California State Congress. Seattle, of course, just became the largest municipality to decriminalize psychedelics. So I think that we're going to see that play out a bit longer before the federal government figures out what it wants to do.
Thanks, Tom. Olivia, I think this is a great panel for you to be a part of because you've probably spoken with a lot of lawyers and institutional type investors like Henri to become a business owner and operator in the space. From your perspective on the ground floor, what does this experience look like raising capital and weeding through the regulatory environment and explaining that to investors that might be skittish at first? I'm sure the audience would love to hear.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really exciting because we're seeing quite a large variety of investors. So family offices to private equity to even just personal wealth investors. So there's quite an array and opportunity to get in. There are a lot of questions in terms of, what the trajectory is and, when an investor will see their return. And there's many different types of companies. So there's more of the drug development companies, which is what I'm involved in. So we're developing medicine with psychedelics to create solutions for particular indications and diseases. There are also other companies that are helping with mental health, like Field Trip, for instance. They have a facilitated psilocybin journey or trip with a patient where they can learn how to face their insecurities, their issues with a doctor or with a psychotherapist, and actually go through a trip per se with them and really start learning how to overcome any challenges that they have. And then there's also companies such as Wiley's, which is the retreats, which is also an amazing experience for people to be able to go and safely use these medicines. I think that for the investor market, it's just an opportunity for getting in early again with just tremendous growth, just as I saw in the cannabis space. So, if you look at Canopy Growth or the Altrias of the world, they're in the billions market cap now. So I think that if you're looking to invest, if there are investors watching this, that it's a really great time because a lot of companies are starting out. There's a lesser valuation now for a huge upside in the coming months.
And Henri and Olivia, Aphrodite is a portfolio company of the Conscious Fund, correct? Or
yes, that's correct.
what did you see in them for from an investment perspective, besides meeting Dr. Koo and Olivia and believing in them as entrepreneurs, but as far as the business model goes?
I'm going to be hugely ambitious here and try and link this to some of the comments that I've been reading. This is a sector where people want to do stuff differently, right? So they want to do better approaches to mental health. They don't want to use broken pharmaceutical company models. We don't want to see the kind of behavior that Tom highlighted, which constricts IP and is kind of legally dubious or greedy. The majority of the good entrepreneurs in this sector are doing stuff because they genuinely want to make a difference. It is about, we are impact investors as financiers. There's lots of impact-orientated family offices, high net worths. The whole sector is really trying to look at lots of different approaches. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And the point, as I mentioned earlier, is to get the therapy in as many patients' hands as possible. So what Olivia and Gigi are doing is looking at women's healthcare. Are women being served by conventional approaches to mental health and addiction and physical problems and issues like the menopause? And what we saw there was people that wanted to change an underserved niche, which is, a new approach. It's not, this is what we've done for women for 2 decades. Both Gigi and Olivia saw a different path forwards. Everybody that we think is viable in the industry has got a unique take on it. And we will back, pro bono and charitable initiatives like Wiley's, through part of our fund platform. We'll look at companies like Olivia's and Gigi's who are innovative commercial entrepreneurs. We'll look at different types of model. We'll look at, sustainable models and clinics. And so what attracted us to Olivia and Gigi and Aphrodite was people wanting to do stuff differently. And we think that if that's done effectively, what you're going to create in psychedelics is disruptive companies. Whether you've got a development of pharmaceutical models that's more ethical, whether you've got a clinic where rich patients subsidize poorer patients, whether you're taking money and putting it into indigenous medicine and indigenous knowledge preservation. There are lots of these different models, and those for us are the most interesting because they will be disruptive, and with a disruptive investment, you can see very, very high upside over the short to medium term. That's really what we're looking for as a fund, is effective, disruptive investments.
Yeah, when the business doesn't exist yet, you can be creative as far as the barrier to entry is whatever you want it. If you're being innovative.
Yeah,
sorry guys.
To add just one more thing. So I know that there's a lot of, I've just been reading some of the comments, but so the really interesting and unique thing about the psychedelic space and using creating new medicines with psychedelics is that, for instance, the women's health industry is so underly represented, and women have traditionally just been, on the back burner and not taken care of in terms of clinical trials and such because of all the different functionalities of women's bodies with hormones and this, that, and the other. So looking at psychedelics to be able to actually disrupt the SSRI model where, if you have a mood disorder, you're just prescribed Zoloft or an SSRI of the such. So it's really interesting to see how we're using psychedelic medicines to help change the paradigm here. This isn't just about, coming up with something to make money. It's literally coming up with a brand new industry to really debunk and change what's been going on traditionally. And I know it's not a huge paradigm shift that, a lot of us very conscious and awake people like myself want to see, but we are light warriors and we're making small changes and steps to move forward. So I hope that you guys can understand that as well.
I'd love to actually just echo Olivia's comment, because I think that that's a very important one. And the work that Henri's doing, financing these companies, getting out of the gate. The cannabis industry is a model in this sense, because it really brought this medicine to such a larger audience. And I'm one of those persons, by the way. So I hadn't tried marijuana since college and really didn't care for it. And this was a long time ago. And it wasn't until I had been representing cannabis companies for, I guess, over 12 years. And then I finally decided to try a joint. And it wasn't a joint, it was probably an edible or something. And now it's become part of my life. And it actually is a joy to me. And I use it for recreational purposes and just to, relax with family and friends and that sort of thing. But others have had sensational benefits that physiologically and psychologically, and they never would have had these benefits if the legalized cannabis industry didn't happen. And that statement could be made about millions or even tens or hundreds of millions of people at this point. That's the case with psychedelics. And I can speak again from personal experience, because in the absence of the conversation that we're having right now, in the absence of the work that Olivia is doing and that Henri's doing, bringing these medicines to a broader audience, I never would have experienced benefits of this. And again, I don't have, there are so many folks that can benefit from these substances so much more than I can. And they wouldn't ever experience the benefits of this, but for the conversation that we're having right now. So I really want to applaud that notion that Olivia made, because if she's not doing what she's doing, and if Henri's not doing what he's doing, and if others like them aren't doing what they're doing, then this medicine is going to stay locked inside of a box. And I don't want to see that happen. I want to see it reach the furthest ends of the earth as far as the people that could actually benefit from the substance. So thank you, Olivia, for saying that.
Yeah. There's a sense where there's no time to be greedy, or else we'll stagnate for another decade.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of you. I appreciate it. I would love to go down the rabbit hole personally with you guys. I don't mean it like that conversationally, but we'll kick it back to Sarah for Q&A.
Thanks,
I saw a lot come through. Hopefully we can answer a few of them.
Absolutely. So there were quite a few questions in the chat. So our panelists, if you're not answering them live on air, feel free to address any of those as well. But let's just kick it off. And again, it's open to any of the panelists. So this is one from Carly. Who are the federal and state licensing and regulatory agencies who are either supporting or stifling growth in this industry? Have there been any federal crackdowns as there was with cannabis early on?
Well, I guess I'll handle that as the lawyer. The two key federal agencies are the DEA and the FDA, to a lesser extent the USDA. Let's focus on the DEA, because first and foremost, they're it right now, right? Until the DEA loosens its grip on the conversation, the FDA is going to be less involved, except in narrow surgical instances, like for instance, in regard to breakthrough status granted to MDMA and granted to psilocybin. But this is really the key agency right now is I think the DEA, which is responsible for enforcement, including as to substances listed on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. After that, it's the FDA. If the FDA can influence the conversation to a great deal, if they come out and start to accept and to articulate the benefits of these substances themselves, that'll have a dramatic effect on the conversation. But those are the three key agencies at this time.
Great, thanks, Tom. And then additionally, again, open floor, but where do you see the most opportunity from a biotech perspective in psychedelics?
I'll have a quick crack at that. I think it's pretty straightforward, and this is quite an important distinction to make to cannabis. As Olivia and Tom said very eloquently, cannabis opened the whole field up. It made plant medicine acceptable. It made people question broken models. The difference between the two is that psychedelic compounds are extremely strong. The opportunity in biotech, bioscience is there is a very strong link between these compounds and specific conditions, symptoms, or issues, whether that's PTSD, traumatic brain injury, addiction, whatever else. And what you're backing is a very strong link between the compound and treating the condition. And you're really just backing a team that will successfully take relatively well-known compounds through clinical trials, compounds or analogs of them, through clinical trials. It's actually fairly straightforward. You take a condition, maybe that's, for example, stuttering. You take a compound that's known to affect those symptoms, and you run it through trials, and you get an FDA approval, so you never have to ring Tom in the middle of the night to bail you out of a jail cell. So the actual biotech stuff is fairly straightforward. They're all conditions under 3 groupings. There's a number of psychedelic compounds, and there are well-worn paths to get stuff through trials.
Great, thank you, Henri. And then last question, and then we'll wrap it up. But what does a safe space consist of for those who are wanting to heal themselves on psychedelics? So I'm sure anyone can pop into this, but even aside from what Olivia mentioned before, the guided resources and things like that, what does that look like? What does a safe space look like for these things?
I'd love to answer that. So safe space in my work means one where you can be vulnerable and still feel protected. That's a critical component to the healing process, I think, is to be in a place where you feel physically safe and to know that the people around you are taking care of you. That's not an easy task. That's not something necessarily easy to create. We've had a lot of success with that with Veterans of War, just thanks to the programming being so front end heavy. We encourage people to be open and vulnerable during our group therapy sessions. So when it comes to the actual medicine workshop itself, they're prepared because they're surrounded by peers that they know are on a like-minded journey. And then after the medicine, it becomes that's really when things get magical, because that group is even more now enforced by the shared perspective that's buoyed by a shared experience. Creating a sense of vulnerability and at the same time ensuring that somebody is protected, I think, are 2 critical components. Hopefully I answered that.
I love it. And feel free, anyone else want to add some input? All right.
I don't think you're going to top that on. It's perfect.
I love it. Well, thank you again, everyone on the panel. We really, really appreciate it. And I have a couple just updates, but one of the attendees dropped this into the chat, and I think it's very appropriate. So they said, this is like comparing it to early cannabis right after 1996. This is like going back in time and getting a chance to redo it, but this time doing it better. Right? Isn't that what it's about? Kind of taking lessons from, what we learned in the other industries and making it better. But again, I just want to thank everyone on the panel. Thank you, Colin, for moderating. And thank you for all of your insights. And also for the attendees, we appreciate your feedback with the polls and you filling those out, because that helps guide our programming. And as Jeff mentioned at the top of the program, we have some great programming coming up in the near future for our Women's Inclusion Network members. November 8th, we have a mentorship workshop on health equity and being social equity agents, which will be led by Dashida Dawson and Dr. Rachel Knox. And then on November 17th, we have a special edition mentor workshop in conjunction with Women Empowered in Cannabis, which will be a pitch boot camp and will also explore different pathways for fundraising. So if you're interested in joining our Women's Inclusion Network, please visit arcview.com/win. And additionally, please join us on Thursday, November 4th at 1 p.m. Pacific for our Arcview Access Infrastructure Pains and Possibilities Part 1, which will be focused on building diversity and inclusion into your foundation. And this is the first of a 3-part series. The second part of that series will be on Wednesday, November 10th at 1 p.m. And that will be the back office, HR, accounting, insurance, and legal, all the things that you need to have in your infrastructure to be successful. So with that said, I will close out this program. I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and tune in for the next Arcview program, and we will see you soon. All right, bye. Thanks.